Something extraordinary lies beneath the surface of the sea. Not the ordinary sand and sediment that blankets most of the ocean floor, not the scattered debris of shipwrecks or the random bones of forgotten vessels, but something far more profound, far more staggering, far more capable of reshaping everything we thought we understood about the ancient world. Somewhere beneath cold, dark, pressing water, there are streets, there are walls. There are doorways that once framed the lives of human beings who woke up every morning, went about their days, raised their children, built their temples, and looked out at a horizon that they believed would always be there waiting for them. And then one day, in a span of time that history has not yet been able to fully measure or explain, all of it disappeared beneath the sea. This is not mythology. This is not the stuff of ancient storytelling passed down through generations of poets and philosophers searching for meaning in metaphor. What we are talking about is real stone, real architecture, real evidence of human civilization sitting on the ocean floor, waiting for the modern world to find it, examine it, and finally begin asking the questions that this discovery demands. Because when you find a city beneath the ocean, you are not simply finding old buildings in an unusual location. You are finding proof that our understanding of ancient history has enormous gaps in it, that the civilizations we know from textbooks and museum displays represent only a fraction of what once existed, and that the sea has been keeping secrets for thousands of years that we are only now beginning to crack open. The discovery we are going to explore in this documentary is one that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community, a community that is generally cautious, methodical, and not easily shaken by new findings. These are people who have dedicated their lives to the slow, careful, painstaking work of recovering the past, and when something genuinely surprises them, when something comes out of the deep water and forces them to reconsider their assumptions, the rest of the world needs to pay attention. Because what sits beneath those waves is not just rubble. It is a fully articulated ancient city, with recognizable structures, organized street grids, preserved architectural features, and evidence of sophisticated human occupation stretching back to a period of history that challenges our established timelines and demands a complete reassessment of how advanced ancient coastal civilizations truly were. We will spend the next 2 hours going deep into this story, and we mean that both literally and figuratively. We will follow the discovery from its first glimmers of possibility to the full-scale underwater excavations that revealed its breathtaking scope. We will explore what the city looked like, how it was built, who might have lived there, and what the ancient Greek world tells us about places like this. We will wrestle with the competing theories about how an entire city ends up beneath the ocean, from violent seismic catastrophes to the slow, relentless climb of rising sea levels that drowned coastal settlements across thousands of years of geological time. We will look at what this discovery means for our understanding of ancient Greek civilization specifically, and we will confront the question that always lurks at the edges of conversations like this one, the ancient legend of Atlantis, and whether a real sunken city changes anything about how we interpret that most famous of all lost city stories. By the time we reach the end of this journey, you will see the ancient world differently. You will look at the ocean differently. And you will understand that beneath the surface of the sea lies not just water and darkness, but an archive of human experience so vast and so rich that generations of future archaeologists will spend their entire careers exploring it and still not reach the end of what it contains. The ancient world was bigger than we knew. The civilizations that shaped human history were more widespread, more sophisticated, and more numerous than our textbooks have told us. And the ocean has been quietly preserving their remains, waiting for the moment when human technology and human curiosity finally became powerful enough to find them. That moment has arrived. To truly understand why the discovery of a submerged ancient city is so profoundly significant, you have to first understand the world that these ancient people lived in, the world that existed before the ocean claimed their streets and their temples and their homes. You have to go back in time, not just a few centuries, but thousands of years, to a period when the coastlines of the Mediterranean and Aegean looked dramatically different from the maps we use today, when sea levels were not fixed and stable, but were actively changing in ways that would have been perceptible within the span of individual human lifetimes. The story begins long before any Greek city was built, long before any Greek sailor ever pushed a wooden hull out into Aegean waters. It begins at the end of the last great ice age, a period that geologists call the late Pleistocene, when enormous sheets of ice covered vast portions of the northern hemisphere and locked up so much of the planet's water in frozen form that global sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels in the Mediterranean region were somewhere between 100 and 140 meters lower than they are now. That is a staggering difference. It means that what is today the bottom of shallow coastal waters, what is today the seabed that divers explore and that fishing nets scrape across, was once dry land, inhabited land, land where ancient people walked, hunted, farmed, and built their lives. As the ice began to melt, the sea began to rise. This was not a sudden process. It happened over thousands of years, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, punctuated by occasional dramatic surges when particularly large sections of ice sheets collapsed into the ocean. But over the broad sweep of geological time, the pattern was consistent and inexorable. The sea was rising. Coastlines that had been dry for millennia were gradually being submerged. Coastal communities that had been built at the water's edge were finding themselves increasingly vulnerable to the encroaching waves. By the time we reached the period that most concerns us, the period of classical and pre-classical Greek civilization, roughly from around 3,000 to 500 years before the Common Era, global sea levels had risen significantly from their Ice Age lows, but they had not yet reached the precise configuration they occupy today. The eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean Sea, the Ionian coast, all of these regions were still experiencing the long tail of post-glacial sea level rise, and the people who built their cities along these shores were doing so in a landscape that was, in a geological sense, still in flux. This is crucial context for everything that follows. When we find an ancient Greek city beneath the water, we are not necessarily looking at a city that was destroyed by some single dramatic catastrophic event. We may be looking at a city that was simply caught in the slow, centuries-long process of coastal inundation, a process that would have proceeded gradually enough for some inhabitants to adapt and move inland, but dramatically enough over the span of generations to eventually leave an entire urban settlement sitting on what had become the floor of the sea. But the story is more complicated and more interesting than simple sea level rise, because the eastern Mediterranean is also one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The tectonic forces that shape the dramatic landscape of Greece, the rugged mountains, the deep valleys, the countless islands scattered across the Aegean like the broken pieces of a shattered coast, these same forces are constantly at work beneath the surface, building pressure and releasing it in earthquakes that can be devastating in their intensity. And when an earthquake strikes coastal terrain, the consequences can include not just the collapse of buildings, but the sudden, violent subsidence of large sections of land, areas that were above sea level one moment finding themselves several meters below it the next, inundated almost instantly by the rushing water of the sea. So when archaeologists look at a submerged ancient city, they are immediately confronted with two very different possible explanations that have very different implications for what the discovery tells us. Was this a city slowly swallowed by gradually rising seas over centuries? Or was it a city that experienced a sudden catastrophic event, an earthquake, a tsunami, a rapid subsidence of the coastal shelf on which it was built, that plunged it beneath the waves in a matter of hours or days? The physical evidence of the city itself, the way its buildings are arranged, the state of their preservation, the orientation of collapsed walls and scattered artifacts, can tell us a great deal about which scenario is more likely. And as we will discover, the answer in the case of our submerged city is complex enough to challenge simple explanations, and demand a nuanced understanding of how multiple forces can combine to produce a single extraordinary outcome. Let us begin to talk about the discovery itself, because before we can analyze and theorize, we need to understand what was found, where it was found, and how the finding came about. Underwater archaeological discoveries rarely happen the way they do in movies, with a single dramatic moment of revelation in which a diver suddenly swims around a corner and comes face to face with a perfectly preserved ancient city. The reality is almost always more gradual, more methodical, and in its own way more interesting, because it involves the intersection of human observation, scientific technology, and the accumulated knowledge of scholars who have been looking for exactly this kind of thing for decades. The discovery of this particular submerged city began, as many of the most important archaeological finds do, not with professional archaeologists at all, but with ordinary people who spend time on and in the sea for reasons entirely unrelated to the past. Fishermen have always been inadvertent archaeologists, pulling up their nets to find pottery shards, bronze objects, and the occasional marble fragment tangled among their catch. Sponge divers exploring the seabed in search of their quarry have stumbled upon ancient wrecks and submerged ruins with a frequency that professional underwater archaeologists find simultaneously wonderful and slightly frustrating, because these informal discoveries often happen without any systematic documentation, and crucial contextual information is lost. In this case, it was a combination of local knowledge and modern technology that first pointed investigators toward the possibility that something significant was lying on the seafloor in this particular location. Local fishermen had long known that certain areas of the seafloor in this region had unusual characteristics, areas where their nets would catch unexpectedly, where the bottom had irregular features that did not match the smooth, sandy profiles of undisturbed seabed. These were the kinds of observations that fishermen passed down to their children and their grandchildren, knowledge embedded in the practical wisdom of people who have worked the same waters for generations. Something was down there. It had been down there long enough to become part of the informal geography of the sea as the local fishing community understood it. When researchers equipped with modern sonar technology began systematic surveys of the seafloor in this region, what they found confirmed and vastly exceeded what local knowledge had suggested. The sonar returns were extraordinary. Instead of the expected profiles of natural seabed formations, the instruments were detecting something that looked unmistakably organized. There were right angles where nature does not produce right angles. There were regular patterns, repetitive structural forms that spoke not of geological processes but of deliberate human construction. There were what appeared to be walls, streets, open spaces that might have been courtyards or plazas, and larger structures whose footprints suggested buildings of significant size and architectural ambition. The sonar images were remarkable enough to prompt immediate interest from the archaeological community, but sonar images, however detailed and compelling, are not the same as physical examination. The next step was to put divers in the water, to actually descend to the seafloor and see with human eyes what the instruments had detected. This transition from remote sensing to direct observation is always a critical moment in underwater archaeology, because it is the point at which the tantalizing outlines revealed by technology either resolve into genuine archaeological significance or turn out to be natural formations that merely happen to produce instrument readings suggesting something more. In this case, the divers found exactly what the sonar had implied they would find, and more. The seafloor in this area was covered with structures, real structures, clearly artificial, clearly the product of deliberate human construction rather than any natural geological process. There were walls built from dressed stone, stone that had been cut and shaped by human hands before being laid in courses that were still recognizable thousands of years after the original builders had walked away from their work. There were what appeared to be paved surfaces, the remains of floors or roadways, flat expanses of fitted stone that lay beneath the accumulated sediment of centuries, but were still visible in outline. There were column bases, those distinctively circular foundations that ancient Greek architecture used to support the colonnaded structures that were such a characteristic feature of Greek civic and religious life. And there was the scale of it. The divers moved through the submerged city, and the extent of it kept revealing itself, structure after structure, wall after wall, the accumulated physical evidence of what had clearly once been a substantial urban settlement. This was not a village or a small outpost. The spatial extent of the ruins, the diversity of their architectural forms, the evidence of multiple types of buildings serving multiple functions, all of this pointed toward a genuine urban center, a place where significant numbers of people had lived and worked and organized their collective existence according to the sophisticated civic principles that we associate with ancient Greek civilization. The depth of the ruins varied across the site. Some of the structures were sitting in relatively shallow water, close enough to the surface that recreational divers would be able to reach them with modest effort. Other parts of the site descended into deeper water, where the pressure and the darkness required more specialized equipment and more experienced divers to investigate properly. This variation in depth was itself informative, suggesting either that the site occupied sloping terrain that was already varying in elevation when it was inhabited, or that different parts of the city had subsided by different amounts over time, or some combination of both. Mapping this depth variation carefully would become one of the key tasks of the archaeological team as they began the systematic work of documenting what they had found. The work of documenting an underwater archaeological site is technically demanding in ways that have no equivalent in terrestrial archaeology. On land, an excavation team can work for hours at a stretch, move easily across their site, use conventional measuring tools and recording equipment, communicate verbally with colleagues, and take photographs in natural light with ordinary cameras. Underwater, none of these things are true. Divers are constrained by their air supply, by the physiological limitations that depth imposes on the human body, by the distorting effects of water on visual perception, by the challenges of communication, and by the difficulty of using tools and recording equipment while weighted, finned, masked, and fighting the constant gentle push and pull of underwater currents. Yet despite all of these challenges, underwater archaeologists have developed sophisticated methodologies for documenting submerged sites with remarkable precision and thoroughness. The use of photogrammetry, the technique of creating three-dimensional models from overlapping photographs, has revolutionized the documentation of underwater sites in recent years. By swimming systematic patterns across a site and capturing thousands of overlapping photographs, researchers can feed that imagery into specialized software that produces detailed three-dimensional models of the ruins, models that can be measured, analyzed, and shared with colleagues around the world without anyone needing to physically descend to the seafloor. These photogrammetric models of our submerged city revealed something that became immediately and centrally important to understanding what this place had been. The city had a clear, organized internal structure. This was not a random scattering of buildings that had grown up organically over centuries without any overarching plan. There was a street grid, a system of lanes and thoroughfares that divided the city into recognizable districts or neighborhoods. The streets had a consistent orientation, which in the context of ancient Greek urban planning is a significant detail, because it tells you something about the foundational principles on which the city was built and the cosmological or practical considerations that governed its layout. Greek urban planning, particularly in the cities founded during the great period of Greek colonization from roughly the 8th through the 5th centuries before the Common Era, often followed systematic principles associated with what ancient sources call the Hippodamian grid, named after Hippodamus of Miletus, who is credited in ancient texts with having rationalized city planning along orthogonal lines. The Hippodamian city was laid out on a regular grid of streets, with distinct zones set aside for public, private, and sacred functions, creating a rational spatial organization that reflected Greek ideas about the good city as an expression of ordered civic life. Whether or not the city we are examining actually follows Hippodamian principles, or whether it represents an earlier or alternative tradition of organized urban planning, is one of the questions that the archaeological investigation must answer. What the photogrammetric models showed was consistent with a planned urban settlement of significant sophistication. The streets were wide enough for wheeled vehicles and for the kind of bustling commercial and civic traffic that a functioning ancient city would generate. The city blocks defined by the street grid contain multiple buildings of varying sizes and apparent functions. Some of the larger structures showed evidence of having been public or civic buildings, their footprints and architectural features distinguishing them from the smaller, more densely packed structures that suggested residential use. And in one area of the site, where the ruins were better preserved than in others, the investigators could make out what appeared to be the remains of a substantial structure that might have been a temple or a major civic building, its foundations laid on a scale that spoke of institutional ambition and communal investment. The question of dating, of establishing when this city was built and when it was inhabited, is one of the most fundamental and also one of the most challenging problems in underwater archaeology. On a terrestrial site, archaeologists can use a wide range of dating techniques on materials that are relatively easy to access and sample. Carbon dating of organic materials, thermoluminescence dating of burned ceramics, dendrochronology of preserved wood, and stratigraphic analysis of soil layers all contribute to building a chronological framework for a site. Underwater, accessing materials for dating is more difficult. The preservation conditions are different and can affect the reliability of some techniques, and the stratigraphic relationship between artifacts and structures can be disturbed by underwater currents in ways that have no equivalent in terrestrial contexts. Nevertheless, the investigators working on our submerged city were able to gather enough material to begin constructing a chronological picture of the site, and what that picture revealed was both exciting and, in the broader context of ancient history, deeply significant. The artifacts recovered from the site, carefully documented in their positions before being retrieved, ranged from ceramics to metal objects to architectural ornaments, and the typological analysis of these objects, the technique of comparing their forms and styles to similar objects from other dated contexts, suggested a range of occupations spanning a remarkably long period. The earliest materials from the site appeared to date to a period well before what we typically think of as classical Greek civilization, pointing toward occupation that predated the great flowering of Greek culture in the 5th century before the Common Era by many centuries. This was not a city built during the golden age of Athens, the time of Pericles and Socrates and the Parthenon. This was a city that had its roots in a much earlier period, in the shadowy transitional era that bridges the Bronze Age civilizations of the Aegean, the Mycenaeans and the Minoans and their contemporaries, with the emerging Iron Age Greek world that would eventually produce classical civilization. This early dating immediately raised the stakes of the discovery considerably. Bronze Age Greek civilization is one of the most fascinating and least fully understood chapters in ancient history. The Mycenaean civilization, which flourished roughly between 1600 and 1100 before the Common Era, was a sophisticated palace-centered society that controlled significant territories, engaged in long-distance trade across the Mediterranean, and produced the warrior culture that Homer would later immortalize in the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Minoans of Crete, slightly earlier, were an even more mysterious civilization, one of the earliest truly urban cultures in the European world, responsible for elaborate palace complexes, a distinctive artistic tradition, and a writing system that was not deciphered until the mid-20th century. What happened to these Bronze Age civilizations is itself one of history's great mysteries. Around 1200 before the Common Era, in a period that scholars call the Late Bronze Age collapse, virtually all of the sophisticated palace-based civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean experienced catastrophic decline or complete collapse. The Mycenaean palace system fell apart. Significant urban centers were abandoned or destroyed. The population of the Aegean region declined dramatically. Trade networks that had connected Greece, Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant for centuries disintegrated. And Greece entered what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, a period of several centuries during which writing disappeared, monumental architecture ceased to be built, and the complex social organization of the Bronze Age gave way to much simpler, more dispersed forms of settlement. If our submerged city has its origins in the Bronze Age, and if it continued to be occupied through the transition period into the early Iron Age, it represents an extraordinary piece of evidence about how people in this region lived through one of history's most dramatic episodes of social and civilizational change. Was it one of the cities that collapsed during the Late Bronze Age catastrophe, or did it somehow survive that collapse and continue into the subsequent period? The artifacts from the site suggest a continuity of occupation that is itself remarkable, evidence that this particular coastal community may have weathered storms that destroyed its contemporaries elsewhere in the Greek world. The later materials from the site, the ceramics and objects that date to what scholars call the Archaic and early Classical periods, roughly the 7th through 5th centuries before the Common Era, speak to a community that had endured and rebuilt, that had emerged from whatever disruptions the Bronze Age collapse had brought and continued to develop its urban life in the centuries that followed. The presence of distinctively archaic Greek ceramics, with their characteristic geometric and then increasingly figurative decorative styles, places this community firmly within the broader cultural world of early Greece, connected through trade and cultural exchange to the wider Greek network of cities and settlements that stretched across the Aegean and Mediterranean world. To truly appreciate what this submerged city represents, you need to understand the broader context of Greek coastal civilization and the extraordinary extent to which the sea shaped every aspect of Greek life and culture. Greece is, above everything else, a maritime civilization. The geography of the Greek world, that complex of peninsulas, islands, and indented coastlines that comprises the Aegean basin, makes the sea not an obstacle or a boundary, but the fundamental medium of connection, commerce, and communication. Greek cities did not turn their backs on the sea. They faced it, embraced it, organized their economies around it, and built their identities in relation to it. The sea was the highway that connected Greek communities to each other and to the wider Mediterranean world. A merchant from an Aegean city could sail to Egypt, to the Black Sea coast, to southern France, to Spain, all within the span of a single sailing season. This maritime connectivity was the foundation of Greek commercial prosperity, because it meant that no Greek city was truly isolated, that every coastal settlement had access to a vast network of exchange through which raw materials, finished goods, ideas, artistic styles, and cultural influences could flow. The sea was also the medium through which Greek civilization spread itself across the Mediterranean in the great colonial movement of the Archaic period, when Greek city-states established daughter colonies at key points around the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts, creating a network of Greek-speaking, Greek-practicing communities that eventually stretched from the eastern coast of the Black Sea all the way to the Atlantic coast of what is now Spain. For a civilization this thoroughly oriented toward the sea, coastal settlements were not peripheral or vulnerable locations to be occupied only when no better alternative was available. They were prime real estate, the most desirable locations for cities and towns because they combine the practical advantages of access to the sea with whatever productive agricultural land existed in the coastal hinterland. The great cities of the ancient Greek world were overwhelmingly coastal. Athens, Corinth, Miletus, Ephesus, Syracuse, Alexandria, Carthage, all of these major centers of ancient civilization sat at or very near the water's edge, because that was where power, prosperity, and connectivity were most easily achieved. This maritime orientation also meant that Greek civilization accumulated an extraordinarily detailed practical knowledge of the sea, its depths and shallows, its currents and winds, its seasonal patterns, and its dangers. Greek sailors and fishermen knew these waters intimately in the way that only people whose lives depend on that knowledge can know them. They knew which capes were dangerous in particular wind conditions, which channels were navigable at what drafts, where the good anchorages were, and where the treacherous shoals lay hidden. And they knew in the practical, embodied way of people who have worked the sea for generations, that the relationship between sea and land was not fixed, that in some places the water was advancing and in other places it was retreating, that coastlines that their grandfathers had known looked subtly different from the coastlines they themselves navigated. This knowledge was embedded in Greek mythology and geography in ways that are often overlooked. Ancient Greek sources contain numerous references to places that had once been dry land or coastal settlements that were now beneath the water, references that have sometimes been dismissed as purely mythological, but that modern archaeological investigation is increasingly revealing as potentially accurate descriptions of real events and real places. The ancient Greeks were not naive about the dynamic relationship between sea and land. They had a sophisticated tradition of thought about geological processes, including the possibility of land subsiding and being swallowed by the sea, that was rooted in direct observation of real phenomena in their own world. This brings us to a figure whose writings have been at the center of every serious conversation about sunken cities and lost civilizations for more than 2,000 years. His name was Plato, and he was one of the greatest philosophers ancient Greece produced. And in two of his dialogues, works known as the Timaeus and the Critias, he told a story about a great civilization that had existed long ago, a civilization of extraordinary power and sophistication that had ruled a vast oceanic empire, and that had been swallowed by the sea in a single terrible day and night of catastrophic destruction. He called this civilization Atlantis. The Atlantis question is impossible to avoid in any serious discussion of submerged ancient cities, not because Plato's account is literally accurate, but because it has so thoroughly shaped the cultural framework through which people think about and interpret underwater discoveries. When a submerged city is found anywhere in the Mediterranean, the ancient Near East, or the Atlantic, the question immediately arises, could this be Atlantis? And while serious archaeologists and historians approach this question with considerable skepticism, it is worth engaging with it carefully rather than dismissing it, because Plato's Atlantis story, even if it is not a literal description of a real place, contains elements that are clearly rooted in real knowledge about the ancient world. Plato places his account of Atlantis in the mouth of characters who claim to be reporting an ancient tradition preserved by Egyptian priests and passed down to the Athenian statesman Solon. According to this account, Atlantis was a powerful maritime civilization that existed approximately 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would place it at roughly 9600 before the Common Era, at the very beginning of the post-glacial period when sea levels were rising rapidly. This civilization allegedly controlled a vast territory centered on a large island in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, and had attempted to conquer the ancient Mediterranean world before being defeated by the primitive ancestors of the Athenians. Following this defeat, Atlantis was destroyed and sunk into the ocean by divine intervention. The scholarly consensus has long been that Plato invented the story of Atlantis as a philosophical device, a way of exploring ideas about the corruption of civilization the hubris of imperial ambition, and the fragility of human achievements in the face of divine judgment. This reading is supported by the way the Atlantis story functions within the dialogues that contain it, where it serves specific philosophical purposes rather than simply being reported as historical fact. Plato was a sophisticated literary artist as well as a philosopher, and he was perfectly capable of inventing a narrative tradition to make a philosophical point. But the Atlantis story contains elements that suggest real knowledge of real events, elements that Plato either invented with remarkable geological prescience or that he derived from actual traditions recording actual occurrences in the ancient past. The description of a civilization destroyed by catastrophic subsidence and flooding corresponds to real geological processes that did actually occur in the post-glacial Mediterranean world. The description of a powerful maritime civilization controlling a network of territories corresponds to what we now know about Bronze Age Aegean civilizations like the Minoans and Mycenaeans. And the time frame, while literally impossible to reconcile with any known civilization, might represent a telescoping or confusion of timelines that is common in oral traditions that attempt to preserve memories of events from the distant past. The most interesting scholarly hypothesis about the relationship between Plato's Atlantis and real historical events is the one that locates the kernel of truth in the story not in a sunken Atlantic island empire, but in the destruction of the Minoan civilization of Crete and its Aegean island settlements, particularly the catastrophic eruption of the Thera volcano, known today as Santorini, which occurred around 1600 before the Common Era. The Thera eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in human history, expelling enormous quantities of ash and pumice into the atmosphere, generating massive tsunamis that devastated coastal settlements across the eastern Mediterranean and causing the partial collapse of the volcanic island itself, sinking a significant portion of what had been inhabited Minoan territory beneath the sea. The parallels between the Thera catastrophe and Plato's Atlantis story are suggestive. A powerful civilization located on an island in the sea, destroyed by a combination of volcanic activity and marine inundation. A disaster of such scale that it became embedded in cultural memory and eventually found its way, transformed and mythologized through generations of oral transmission, into the account that Plato recorded. Whether you find this hypothesis convincing or not, it illustrates the broader point that the mythological traditions of ancient cultures often preserve, in distorted and embellished form, genuine memories of real catastrophic events that actually occurred. And this is directly relevant to our submerged city, because the traditions that surrounded the discovery, the local knowledge that first pointed investigators toward the site, included references to ancient stories about a coastal city that had been lost to the sea. These were not Atlantis stories, not tales of mythological grandeur and divine punishment. They were more modest, more specific, more local in character. They described a real place with a real name, a place that people in the region had been dimly aware of for generations, a place that occupied an uncertain zone between history and legend because the physical evidence of its existence was hidden beneath the water where ordinary people could not see it. The discovery of the submerged city transformed that uncertain tradition into confirmed historical reality. The stories had been right. There was a city there. It had gone beneath the sea. And now, for the first time in thousands of years, human beings were going down to look at it. Let us get back to the physical reality of the site and what the archaeological investigation was revealing about how it was built and what it looked like when it was a living city, because one of the most striking aspects of this discovery is the quality of the preservation. Underwater sites are often assumed to be better preserved than terrestrial ones, and in some respects this is true. Stone structures that have been sealed beneath marine sediment are protected from the weathering processes that erode and eventually destroy exposed buildings on land. But underwater sites also have their own preservation challenges. from the biological organisms that attack organic materials and certain types of stone, to the physical forces of waves and currents that can disturb and scatter artifacts and architectural elements. In the case of this particular site, the preservation is extraordinary by any standard. The marine sediment that covered much of the site over the millennia had acted as a protective blanket, sealing the structures beneath it and shielding them from the most destructive biological and physical processes. Where the sediment had been carefully removed by the archaeological team using water jets and suction devices, the underlying stone was revealed in a state of preservation that astonished the investigators. Carved surfaces that had been protected by the sediment were still sharp and clear. Building stones that had been sealed within collapsed wall rubble were found with their original surfaces largely intact. And in several locations, the team discovered features whose preservation went beyond what anyone had initially dared hope for. In one area of the site, excavators clearing sediment from a partially collapsed structure made a discovery that immediately became one of the defining moments of the entire investigation. Beneath a layer of collapsed roofing material, sealed by the implosion of the building's upper story and then buried by centuries of marine sediment, they found what appeared to be a mosaic floor. Mosaic floors are one of the characteristic art forms of the ancient Greek and later Roman world, created by pressing small pieces of colored stone or glass into a wet plaster or mortar bed to create decorative designs and pictorial scenes. The existence of mosaic floors is generally associated with significant prosperity because producing them required skilled craftsmen and access to materials of different colors from various sources. A mosaic floor in a submerged ancient city was therefore not just an aesthetically exciting find. It was evidence of the economic sophistication and cultural connection of the community that had produced it. The mosaic that was revealed as the sediment was painstakingly cleared away depicted a series of geometric patterns framing what appeared to be a figural scene, though the damage to the central portion of the floor meant that the full image could not be recovered. The geometric border patterns, however, were sufficiently preserved to allow stylistic analysis, and they were consistent with decorative traditions that can be dated to a specific period in Greek artistic development, providing one of the most reliable chronological anchors for the site. The patterns were confident and sophisticated, executed by craftsmen who clearly had extensive experience with this type of work, and they spoke of a community that was fully integrated into the broader Greek cultural world rather than a provincial outpost on the margins of that world. The architectural investigation of the larger structures in the site revealed even more about the sophistication of the city's builders and inhabitants. The temple or major civic building that had been identified in the earlier survey proved, on closer examination, to be a structure of remarkable ambition. Its foundations were laid in a manner consistent with the most demanding standards of ancient Greek temple construction, with large, carefully fitted blocks of local stone forming a platform on which the walls and columns had been raised. The column bases that survived gave the investigators the ability to calculate the probable spacing and diameter of the columns, and from that to estimate the height and roofline of the building. What emerged from these calculations was a structure that, when it was standing, would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the architecture of classical Greece, a columned building of significant size, probably serving as a religious sanctuary, that would have dominated its surroundings and been visible from a considerable distance at sea. This visibility from the sea is not an incidental point. In the ancient Mediterranean world, temples and major civic buildings were often deliberately positioned not just for functional reasons but for visual impact, both on their own communities and on approaching seafarers. A prominent temple on a headland or a hilltop was a landmark as well as a place of worship, a beacon that announced the presence of civilization to anyone approaching by water, and that served the practical navigational purpose of helping sailors identify their position along an otherwise featureless coastline. A city with a temple that was clearly visible from the sea was a city that understood its relationship to maritime commerce and wanted to signal its presence and its prosperity to the world. As the investigation of the submerged city deepened and the amount of data recovered from the site grew, the team of researchers working on the project began the painstaking process of integrating all of this physical evidence into a coherent picture of what the city had been, how it had functioned, and who had lived in it. This is always the most intellectually demanding phase of any archaeological project, the movement from raw data, measurements, photographs, artifact descriptions, and stratigraphic observations to historical interpretation, the attempt to use physical evidence to reconstruct the human reality of a place that no longer exists in its original form. What emerged from this interpretive process was a portrait of a community that was in many ways typical of the ancient Greek world, and in other ways distinctive in ways that reflected its particular coastal location and the specific historical circumstances of the region in which it was situated. Let us try to reconstruct, as fully as the evidence allows, what this city looked like when it was a living place. Approaching the city from the sea, as the vast majority of its visitors and much of its trade would have done in antiquity, the first thing you would have seen was the architectural profile of the settlement against the backdrop of the coastal landscape. Assuming the city was situated in the kind of location typical for Greek coastal towns, it would have occupied a spot where natural geography provided both practical advantages and aesthetic drama. A protected harbor, natural or artificially improved, would have offered safe anchorage for the fishing boats and trading vessels that were the arteries of the city's economic life. Behind the harbor, the city would have climbed the coastal terrain, its buildings arranged according to the natural topography and the demands of the street plan, with the most important structures elevated above the rest on whatever high ground the site offered. The harbor itself would have been a busy, noisy, intensely human place. Ancient harbors were the commercial hearts of coastal cities, the point of contact between the city and the wider world, where goods arrived and departed, where travelers and merchants came ashore, where the fishing fleet launched and returned with its catch. Archaeological evidence from Greek harbor sites generally points to an infrastructure of stone quays and jetties, warehouses for storing goods, and the market facilities where the produce of the sea and the products of long-distance trade were bought and sold. Whether our submerged city had all of these features is something the archaeological investigation is still working to establish, because the harbor area is one of the more complex and difficult parts of the site to excavate given the depth of the accumulated sediment and the technical challenges of working in what would have been the most dynamically active zone of the ancient waterfront. Moving inland from the harbor, you would have entered the commercial and civic heart of the city. Greek cities typically organized their public life around an agora, an open public space that served simultaneously as marketplace, meeting place, and the stage on which civic and political life was performed. The agora was where citizens gathered to hear public announcements, to debate political questions, to conduct business, to socialize, and to participate in the religious festivals and civic ceremonies that structured the communal life of the ancient Greek city. Identifying the agora in a submerged site is both important and challenging, because it was by definition an open space, and open spaces leave less obvious physical traces than the buildings that surround them. But the spatial organization of the street grid and the distribution of surrounding structures can often allow archaeologists to identify the location of the agora, even when direct evidence of the open space itself is limited. In our submerged city, the investigators believe they have identified a candidate location for the agora based on exactly this kind of indirect reasoning. There is a zone within the site where the building density is notably lower than in surrounding areas, a space defined by streets on at least two sides and bounded by what appear to be public or commercial structures. The largest of these surrounding structures, located on what would have been the north side of the space, shows architectural features consistent with a stoa, the covered colonnade that ancient Greek cities typically placed along one or more sides of their agoras to provide shaded space for commerce and civic gatherings. Stoas are architecturally distinctive, characterized by long, low profiles and regular column spacing, and while the one in our submerged city is too damaged for complete reconstruction, enough remains to confirm the identification with reasonable confidence. Around the probable agora and along the main streets of the city, the evidence for commercial and artisanal activity is abundant. Workshops identifiable by the concentrations of manufacturing debris found in their vicinity suggest a city with an active craft production sector. There is evidence for metalworking, for pottery production, and possibly for the kind of specialized craft production, fine textiles, carved objects, luxury goods, that would have required skilled craftsmen and generated goods valuable enough to justify the costs of long-distance trade. The distribution of pottery from different production centers, some local and some clearly imported from elsewhere in the Greek world, tells a story of a community connected by commercial networks to a wide geography of production and exchange. The residential quarters of the city, where the bulk of the population lived out their daily lives, are among the most informative parts of the site from a social and historical perspective. Greek domestic architecture of the classical and pre-classical periods followed a relatively consistent set of principles, centered on the concept of the courtyard house, an inward-facing residential structure organized around a central open courtyard that provided light, air, and private outdoor space to the family within. The courtyard house was well adapted to the Mediterranean climate, where hot summers made shade and ventilation critical concerns, and where the separation of private domestic space from the public world of the street and the agora was an important social and cultural value. The houses in our submerged city conform to this general pattern, though with local variations that reflect the specific social and economic conditions of this particular community. The smallest houses are modest structures, their room arrangements suggesting the limited space of families without significant resources, but with sufficient means to maintain a permanent stone-built residence rather than the more temporary structures that the very poor might inhabit. The larger houses are more elaborate, their courtyard arrangements more spacious, their construction more careful, and the quality of their finishing materials higher. The distribution of these different types across the city's neighborhoods is itself revealing, suggesting a social geography in which wealth and status were not randomly distributed, but concentrated in particular areas of the city that had advantages of proximity to the harbor or the civic center. In the most elaborately appointed of the residential structures, the investigators found evidence of decorative programs that went beyond the practical necessities of domestic life and pointed toward the aesthetic aspirations of families with means and cultural ambition. Beyond the mosaic floor already mentioned, there are traces of wall plaster that preserve faint remnants of painted decoration, the kind of colorful fresco painting that was a standard feature of prosperous Greek domestic interiors. The colors that survive, principally reds, blacks, and the characteristic terracotta tones of Greek decorative painting, speak of rooms that were once vivid and warm, spaces designed not just for habitation, but for the expression of cultural identity and social status. Among the artifacts recovered from the residential areas of the city, some of the most informative are the ceramic vessels that represent the everyday material culture of the inhabitants. Greek pottery is one of the most thoroughly studied artifact categories in ancient history, and the typological sequences that scholars have developed allow the forms and styles of vessels to be dated with considerable precision and to be assigned to particular regional production traditions. The pottery from our submerged city is a mixture of locally produced wares and imported pieces, with the imported ceramics coming from some of the most prominent production centers in the Greek world. The presence of high-quality imported pottery in the residential context is significant because it indicates that ordinary households in this city had access to the products of Greek commercial networks, that they were part of the broader economic world of ancient Greece rather than isolated from it. Particularly striking is the presence of ceramic vessels associated with the drinking of wine, an activity of enormous social and cultural significance in the ancient Greek world. The Symposium, the formal drinking party that was one of the central institutions of Greek male social life, required a specific set of ceramic vessels: the crater for mixing wine with water, the amphora for storing the wine, the kylix from which it was drunk, and a variety of serving vessels. The presence of symposium ware in the residential contexts of our submerged city tells us that the social practices of the broader Greek world, including the elaborate ritual of the symposium with its complex rules of etiquette and its cultural significance as a space for intellectual and artistic performance, were part of the cultural life of this coastal community. These were people who participated fully in the social and cultural world of ancient Greece, not provincial outsiders looking in from the margins. The religious life of the city is one of the aspects most thoroughly reflected in the physical remains of the site, because Greek religion expressed itself so powerfully in architecture and material culture. We have already discussed the large temple or civic building that appears to have been one of the most prominent structures in the city. But the evidence for religious practice is not limited to this single major structure. Scattered across the site are smaller shrines, votive deposits, and cult installations that speak of a religious life that permeated every aspect of the city's existence rather than being confined to designated sacred spaces. Greek religion was fundamentally local and polytheistic, meaning that while all Greeks shared a common pantheon of Olympian deities headed by Zeus and including Athena, Apollo, Poseidon, Demeter, and the rest, the specific cult practices of individual cities showed enormous variation. Each city had its own patron deity or deities, its own festival calendar, its own specific traditions of ritual practice that were inherited from the founding of the community and modified over time in response to local circumstances and historical events. Understanding which deities were particularly important in our submerged city requires examining the votive deposits, the objects that were deliberately dedicated to the gods as offerings, because the types of offerings and the iconography of any associated religious artwork or inscriptions can reveal which divine powers the community was most urgently soliciting. The votive deposits recovered from the site are extraordinarily informative in this regard. Among the offerings dedicated at what appears to have been one of the smaller shrine locations, the investigators found a concentration of small terracotta figurines, the mass-produced devotional objects that were among the most common forms of religious offering in the ancient Greek world. These figurines represent a range of divine and semi-divine figures, and the most numerous among them depict a female figure that can be identified on the basis of her attributes and iconography as either Aphrodite or one of the marine deities, goddesses associated with the sea and with the powers that govern the waters on which this coastal community so thoroughly depended. The prominence of marine religious iconography in the votive deposits is not surprising for a coastal city, but it is significant. It tells us that the community organized a significant portion of its religious life around the powers that govern the sea, which is exactly what you would expect from people whose livelihoods, whose safety, and whose connection to the wider world all depended on the mood and favor of those powers. Greek fishermen and sailors were deeply religious people, not necessarily in a philosophical sense, but in the practical, urgent sense of people who regularly put themselves in situations where the difference between life and death was a shift in the wind or a change in the current, and who therefore had very strong reasons to cultivate good relationships with whatever powers governed such things. There is also evidence at the site for the worship of deities associated with the protection of the city as a community, the boundary marking and guardian functions that Greek religion assigned to certain divine figures. These included Hephaestus as patron of craftsmen and fire, Hermes as protector of travelers and commerce, and the civic goddess Athena, whose worship was widespread across the Greek world in her role as guardian of cities and patron of the arts of civilization. The presence of a substantial temple structure that might be dedicated to such a civic deity would be consistent with the city's apparent sophistication and its sense of itself as a full participant in the community of Greek urban civilization. One of the most fascinating and ultimately most important questions that the investigation of this submerged city raises is the question of its relationship to the wider political world of ancient Greece. Greek cities in antiquity did not exist in isolation. They were embedded in complex webs of political, military, and economic relationships with other cities and with the larger political powers that periodically dominated the Greek world. Understanding where our submerged city fit in these networks, who it was allied with or dependent upon, what political identity its inhabitants would have claimed, is essential for placing it in its proper historical context. The evidence for political relationships in the archaeological record is indirect but not absent. The presence of particular types of coins is one of the most informative indicators of political and economic relationships, because ancient Greek cities typically minted their own coinage, and the circulation of particular coinages across a region reflects the commercial networks and political relationships that connected different communities. The coins recovered from our submerged city include examples from several different minting authorities, reflecting a community engaged in commerce with multiple partners rather than being economically dependent on a single dominant center. The presence of particular ceramic types can also illuminate political and economic relationships. The specific production centers from which the imported pottery in our submerged city originated suggest commercial connections with several of the major Greek trading centers of the Aegean, connections that would have been maintained through regular shipping routes and through the trading relationships that sustained the commercial networks of the ancient Greek world. A community that is importing pottery from multiple sources across the Aegean is a community that is integrated into the mainstream of Greek commercial life, participating in the long-distance exchange networks that were one of the defining features of Greek economic civilization. The building techniques and architectural styles used in the city also carry cultural and political information. Ancient Greek architecture was not uniform across the Greek world. Different regions developed characteristic building traditions, specific ways of dressing stone, distinctive column proportions and capital designs, particular preferences in the organization of internal spaces and the treatment of exterior facades. These regional traditions were not hermetically sealed from each other, and the movement of craftsmen, the adoption of architectural ideas through cultural contact, and the deliberate imitation of prestigious models all meant that buildings could incorporate elements from multiple regional traditions. But the dominant tradition in a given building complex usually reflects the primary cultural affiliations of the community that built it. The architectural tradition visible in our submerged city is primarily consistent with the building traditions of the Eastern Aegean and Ionian world, the coast of what is today Western Turkey, and the island chains of the Central Aegean. This regional attribution, if it is confirmed by continued investigation, would have significant implications for understanding the city's origins and political history. The Ionian cities of the Eastern Aegean were among the most culturally dynamic communities in the ancient Greek world, responsible for some of the most important intellectual and artistic innovations of the Archaic period, and strongly connected through trade and cultural exchange to the wider Mediterranean world, including the great civilizations of Egypt and the Near East. If our submerged city was part of this Ionian cultural sphere, It was therefore not a peripheral or isolated community, but rather one connected to some of the most intellectually and commercially vibrant communities in the ancient Greek world. And it was a community that, if it was active during the great period of Ionian cultural flourishing in the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, would have been contemporary with some of the most transformative intellectual developments in human history, including the emergence of Greek philosophy, the beginnings of systematic scientific inquiry, and the development of the historical tradition that would eventually produce figures like Herodotus, the father of history himself. We should pause here to consider what it means that we are only now finding the city, and to ask why it took so long for modern archaeology to recognize what lay beneath these particular waters. The question is important because it touches on one of the most significant and underappreciated aspects of the broader story of underwater archaeology, which is that the vast majority of the submerged ancient world has not yet been found, let alone studied. What we know about the ancient past is based overwhelmingly on what has survived above the waterline, and the extraordinary scale of what lies beneath is only beginning to be appreciated. The reasons why this particular city was not found sooner are a combination of practical and historical factors. The underwater exploration of ancient sites requires specialized equipment, specifically trained personnel, institutional support, and funding that have only been consistently available to archaeology in relatively recent decades. Before the development of self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, which became widely available in the 1950s, systematic underwater investigation of submerged sites was essentially impossible. Before the development of sonar technology, capable of resolving the features of submerged structures with sufficient detail to be useful for archaeological prospection, finding sites like our submerged city required either extremely good luck or very specific prior knowledge of where to look. The development of these technologies transformed what was possible in underwater archaeology, but the transformation took time. The discipline had to develop its own methodologies, train its own practitioners, build its own body of knowledge about how sites form and how they should be investigated underwater, and demonstrate to funding agencies and academic institutions that the results justified the considerable costs involved. All of this took decades, and it is only in the past 30 or 40 years that underwater archaeology has fully come into its own as a systematic and productive research discipline capable of generating the kind of results that our submerged city represents. There is also a practical issue of prioritization. The oceans are vast, and even in the relatively confined waters of the Aegean and Mediterranean, the area of potentially productive seafloor is enormous. Archaeological survey is time-consuming and expensive, and even with the best sonar technology available, you still need to decide where to look before you can look there. The decisions about where to focus survey effort are necessarily influenced by prior knowledge, by existing documentary and textual evidence that suggests particular areas might be productive, by the informal knowledge of local communities who have observed unusual features of the seafloor in their working of the waters, and by the specific research questions that investigators are trying to answer. This last point is perhaps the most important. Archaeological investigations are not random searches. They are organized around specific questions about the ancient past, and those questions reflect the state of existing knowledge and the priorities of the scholarly community at any given moment. The recognition that sea level rise and coastal subsidence had affected enormous areas of the ancient Mediterranean, and that coastal settlements submerged by these processes might be found and investigated using underwater archaeological methods, has only gradually become a central focus of research interest. As it has done so, survey effort has been redirected toward coastal areas with high potential for such discoveries, and the results have been dramatic. Our submerged city is one of the most spectacular of these results, but it is not an isolated phenomenon. Across the Mediterranean and Aegean, underwater archaeological investigation is revealing a landscape of submerged ancient sites that collectively point toward a dramatically different picture of ancient coastal occupation than the one reconstructed solely from terrestrial evidence. There are submerged Bronze Age settlements off the coast of Greece. There are submerged Phoenician harbor works off the coast of the Levant. There are submerged Roman cities beneath the Bay of Naples, inundated by the same volcanic and seismic processes that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum. There are submerged prehistoric hunting and fishing camps on the floor of what is now the North Sea, places where our ancestors walked and lived during the Ice Age when those waters were dry land. The picture that emerges from all of this is of a past that is far more extensive than we knew, a world of human achievement and human habitation that stretches not just across the dry land of the continents, but out beneath the surface of the sea to depths that our conventional archaeological methods were never designed to reach. Reclaiming that submerged past is one of the great challenges and great opportunities of 21st century archaeology, and our submerged ancient city is one of the most compelling demonstrations of what can be achieved when the necessary will, technology, and expertise are brought to bear on the problem. The question of what ultimately happened to this city, how it went from a functioning urban settlement to a collection of ruins on the seafloor, is the one that has most captured public imagination, and that requires the most careful analysis of the available evidence. There are, as we have noted, several possible explanatory mechanisms for the submergence of a coastal city, and distinguishing between them requires examining the physical evidence of the site with great care. The most straightforward explanation for a submerged coastal city is gradual sea level rise over time. As we discussed in the opening sections of this documentary, post-glacial sea level rise has been a consistent feature of the Mediterranean world for the past 20,000 years, and even after the major sea level rise of the early post-glacial period slowed down, the sea has continued to very gradually advance in many areas. In regions where the coastal terrain is low-lying and gently sloping, even a small rise in sea level can inundate a significant area of previously dry land. A city built at or just above sea level in a flat coastal area could find itself increasingly waterlogged and eventually submerged simply through the slow advance of the sea over centuries. This type of submergence would produce a distinctive pattern in the archaeological record. The city would not show evidence of sudden destruction or catastrophic collapse. Instead, the pattern of abandonment would be gradual, with the lowest lying parts of the city being abandoned first as they became regularly flooded, while the higher parts continued to be occupied for some time. The artifacts found in such a gradually abandoned city would show a pattern of selective removal, with the most valuable and portable objects taken when residents moved away, and only the heavier, less portable, or less valuable items left behind. There might be evidence of deliberate dismantling of buildings to salvage usable stone and materials for construction elsewhere. A sudden catastrophic event, by contrast, would produce a very different pattern. If the city were destroyed by an earthquake and associated tsunami, you would expect to find evidence of violent structural collapse, with walls fallen in the direction of the wave that knocked them down and debris distributed in patterns consistent with the hydrodynamic forces involved. Artifacts would be scattered by the violence of the event, concentrated in unusual ways by the action of the water, and the overall pattern of the site would reflect the chaos of sudden destruction rather than the orderly winding down of a community making a managed withdrawal from an increasingly hostile location. Coastal subsidence, the sudden sinking of the ground on which a city is built due to seismic activity, would produce yet another distinctive pattern. In subsidence events, the physical structures of the city might remain relatively intact even as the ground beneath them drops, because the movement is downward rather than lateral, and the buildings are not subjected to the kind of shear forces that cause walls to fall. A city that sinks rapidly due to subsidence might therefore preserve its building outlines very well even though the buildings are now beneath the sea, because they went down as a unit rather than being scattered or collapsed by the event that submerged them. The evidence from our submerged city suggests a picture that is more complex than any of these single explanations can account for. There is evidence of deliberate abandonment and selective removal of materials from some parts of the site, suggesting that at least some of the population had time to remove their most valuable possessions before the city was lost. But there is also evidence of sudden violent events in other parts of the site, locations where the pattern of structural collapse and artifact distribution speaks of forces rather more sudden and violent than a managed withdrawal. And the overall preservation of the site's urban structure, the relative intactness of the street grid and the recognizable building outlines, is more consistent with a subsidence event than with the total destruction that a large tsunami would typically cause. The most probable explanation, based on the totality of the evidence currently available, appears to be a scenario involving multiple contributing factors acting over a period of time rather than a single catastrophic event. The city may have been subject to gradual sea level rise over centuries, slowly lowering its margins of safety against coastal flooding and making its lowest lying areas increasingly difficult to inhabit. This process may have been punctuated by one or more significant seismic events that caused portions of the coastal terrain to subside suddenly, accelerating the inundation of the city significantly and perhaps triggering the more catastrophic-looking damage visible in some parts of the site. The combination of gradual process and sudden acceleration is itself a common pattern in geological histories, and it produces exactly the mixed evidence that our site presents. What happened to the people of this city? This is the question that ultimately underlies all of the technical and scientific analysis, the fundamentally human question at the heart of the archaeological enterprise. We know the physical record of the city in some detail. We know roughly when it was built and roughly when it was abandoned. We know something about what it looked like and how it functioned. But what was the experience of the people who lived in it and who eventually left it? What did it mean to them to lose their city to the sea, and where did they go when they left? The archaeological evidence can provide partial answers to some of these questions, but the most important answers, if they are to be recovered at all, must come from textual sources, from the written records that ancient Greek civilization produced in such abundance and that preserve, among much else, the human dimensions of historical events that the physical record cannot capture. Unfortunately, our submerged city has not yet yielded any written texts, which is not surprising since the organic materials on which ancient writing was most commonly done, papyrus and wooden tablets, do not survive in marine environments except under very specific conditions. The stone-carved inscriptions that do sometimes survive in underwater contexts have not been found at the site, though the investigation is not complete, and there remains hope that epigraphic evidence will eventually come to light. In the absence of texts from the site itself, the investigative team has been mining ancient literary and geographical sources for any references that might correspond to the city whose physical remains they have been excavating. This is the kind of detective work that is central to historical archaeology, the attempt to match the physical evidence of archaeological discovery with the fragmentary textual evidence of ancient literature and geography to establish a historical identity for a site that the archaeology alone cannot name. The ancient Greek geographical tradition is remarkably rich in references to coastal settlements of all sizes, from major cities to minor harbor stations and fishing villages. Ancient geographers like Strabo, who wrote his comprehensive geographical survey of the known world in the late 1st century before the Common Era, and earlier writers like Scylax of Carianda and Hecataeus of Miletus, who produced some of the earliest systematic accounts of Mediterranean coastlines, preserved information about settlements that in many cases no longer existed in their own time, having been abandoned, destroyed. or submerged in the centuries between their founding and the era when the geographers were writing. Among the coastal settlements mentioned in these ancient geographical texts are several that cannot be confidently identified with any known archaeological site, places that the ancient writers describe with sufficient detail to establish their general location and some aspects of their character, but that have never been found in the terrestrial archaeological record. Some of these unidentified settlements are candidates for identification with our submerged city, and the research team is working carefully through the textual evidence to assess which of these candidates, if any, is most consistent with what the archaeology has revealed. This process of textual identification is not just an academic exercise. If the submerged city can be identified with a settlement mentioned in ancient sources, those sources can provide historical context that the archaeology alone cannot offer, information about the city's political history, its founding traditions, its relationships with other communities, and potentially even specific historical events that affected it. Ancient texts sometimes preserve memories of catastrophic events, earthquakes, floods, the sudden abandonment of cities, that have no obvious physical context but that might be explained by the kind of marine submergence event that our investigation is documenting. Finding the textual echo of the physical discovery would be one of the most exciting possible outcomes of the ongoing research. The broader implications of this discovery for our understanding of ancient Greek civilization are profound and still being worked out. But even at this stage of the investigation, it is possible to identify several ways in which the submerged city forces us to revise or refine our picture of the ancient Greek world. First, and perhaps most importantly, the discovery confirms what has long been suspected, but rarely so dramatically demonstrated, that the coastal settlements of the ancient Greek world were far more numerous and more substantial than the terrestrial archaeological record alone would suggest. The sites we know from terrestrial excavation represent a biased sample of the ancient world, heavily weighted toward locations that have been continuously occupied or that survived above water, and missing entirely the significant proportion of ancient coastal civilization that was gradually submerged by sea level rise and coastal change. Our submerged city is one data point in what is clearly a much larger pattern, and its discovery should prompt a systematic reassessment of the potential for submerged settlement across all of the coastal regions that were occupied in antiquity. Second, the discovery provides important evidence about the adaptability and resilience of ancient coastal communities in the face of environmental change. The inhabitants of our submerged city lived through centuries of gradually changing coastal conditions, and the evidence suggests that they responded to these changes with considerable resourcefulness, modifying their city's infrastructure, adapting their building practices to rising water tables, and maintaining their community's economic and cultural vitality even as the environment around them changed. Eventually, the changes overwhelmed the community's capacity to adapt, and the city was abandoned. But the length of occupation that the archaeological evidence documents, spanning centuries of environmental instability, speaks to a human capacity for resilience and adaptation that should perhaps not surprise us, but that is nonetheless impressive. Third, the city provides new evidence about the geographical extent and cultural integration of ancient Greek civilization. The finding that this coastal community, located in a region that might have been expected to be culturally peripheral, was deeply integrated into the mainstream of Greek cultural and commercial life, importing goods from major production centers, following architectural traditions consistent with the most sophisticated Greek building practices, and participating in the cultural institutions of symposium drinking and public religious life. Is an important corrective to any tendency to see Greek civilization as concentrated exclusively in a few famous major centers. The ancient Greek world was a world of hundreds or thousands of communities, most of them small or medium-sized, all of them participating in a shared cultural framework while also expressing their own local identities and traditions. The famous centers, Athens and Corinth and Sparta and Miletus, were important partly because of their size and power, and partly because they happened to generate the texts and monuments that survived most robustly into later times. But the civilization those famous centers represented was also the civilization of countless smaller communities, communities like our submerged city, whose names we may never know with certainty, but whose lives and achievements were no less real and no less important to the total picture of what ancient Greece was. As we approach the end of the first part of our exploration of this extraordinary discovery, it is worth pausing to reflect on the strange and poignant dimension of what underwater archaeology does. It recovers the physical remains of human lives that were lived in full awareness of the same fundamental conditions that govern all human existence: the need for food and shelter and community, the desire for beauty and meaning, the experience of joy and loss, the hope that what you build and what you love will endure. The people who laid the mosaic floor in that house beneath the sea, who carried the kylix to their lips at a symposium in a room decorated with painted walls, who dedicated terracotta figurines at the shrine of their marine goddess and asked her to protect their boats and their sailors, these were people as fully human as anyone alive today, and they lost their city. Whether it was sudden or gradual, catastrophic or incremental, the loss was real. A community that had existed for centuries, that had built its identity around a specific place and a specific relationship with the sea, found itself dispossessed of that place, forced to watch as the water reclaimed the streets and the buildings and the spaces that had been the physical framework of their collective life. Where they went, how they maintained their community in the aftermath, whether they rebuilt elsewhere and carried their traditions and their memories with them to a new location. These are questions that the archaeology can only partially answer, but that are fully worthy of historical attention and human sympathy. The sea took their city, and the sea kept it, sealed it in sediment, preserved it in darkness, held it in trust across thousands of years, until the moment when our technology and our curiosity were finally adequate to find it and begin to understand what it means. There is something almost like justice in that, in the idea that the same element that destroyed the community has also served as its long-term archivist, maintaining the physical evidence of its existence against the day when someone would come looking. We came looking, we found it, and what we found is still, even after all of this investigation, only partially understood. The site is vast, and the work of excavation is slow, careful, and necessarily incomplete. Entire sections of the city remain unexplored beneath their protective covering of marine sediment. Artifacts that would transform our understanding of specific aspects of the site's history lie waiting for the meticulous hands and curious minds of future researchers. The story of our submerged city is not finished. In many important respects, it is barely begun. But what has already been recovered is enough to make one thing absolutely clear. Beneath the waves of the ancient Greek world, there are cities waiting to be found, stories waiting to be told, and chapters of human history that we did not know existed. The ocean is not a dead space at the margins of human civilization. It is an archive, the largest and least explored archive on Earth, and it contains within it a version of the ancient past that is richer and more complex and more full of human achievement than we had dared to imagine. We have opened one of its pages. In the second part of this documentary, we will go deeper still, exploring what further investigation has revealed about the city's final years, about the specific geological events that sealed its fate, about the remarkable parallels between this discovery and the great myth of Atlantis, and about what the future of underwater archaeology promises to reveal about all the cities, all the civilizations, all the human stories still resting quietly on the floors of the world's ancient seas. The ocean has been keeping its secrets for thousands of years. we are finally learning to ask the right questions to unlock them. And the answers, as this extraordinary discovery has shown us, are more magnificent and more moving than we had ever allowed ourselves to hope. Stay with us. The story continues beneath the waves. The story we began in the first part of this documentary is one that reaches across thousands of years of human history, spans the boundary between land and sea, and touches on some of the most profound questions we can ask about the civilizations that came before us. We have explored the discovery of a submerged ancient city beneath the waters of the Aegean, examined the physical evidence that archaeological investigation has revealed, and begun to reconstruct the lives of the people who built and inhabited this remarkable place before the sea claimed it. Now, in this second part, we will go deeper still into the mysteries that this discovery presents. We will examine the specific geological events that appear to have sealed the city's fate, exploring the science of earthquakes, tsunamis, and coastal subsidence that govern the final chapter of this community's existence. We will look at the remarkable artifacts that have been recovered from the site and what they tell us about the daily lives, the religious practices, and the cultural connections of the people who lived there. We will confront directly the question of Atlantis, that most famous and most controversial of all lost city legends, and ask what a real submerged ancient city can teach us about the relationship between myth and historical reality. We will explore what this discovery means for the future of underwater archaeology and for our understanding of the ancient Mediterranean world. And we will reflect on the human dimensions of this story, the lives that were lived and lost, the community that was built and destroyed, and the strange persistence of memory that has allowed us, thousands of years later, to find and begin to understand what happened here. The sea has been keeping its secrets for millennia. We are only now developing the tools and the knowledge to recover them. What lies beneath the waves is not just rubble and sediment, but the preserved remains of human achievement, human aspiration, and human tragedy. This is the story of one city that the ocean claimed, but it is also the story of all the cities, all the settlements, all the human communities that have been lost to the rising waters over the long course of human history. It is a story that belongs to all of us because it reminds us that the relationship between human civilization and the natural world has always been dynamic, always been uncertain, and has never guaranteed the permanence of anything we build. Let us continue our journey beneath the waves. To understand what happened to this city in its final years and final days, we need to understand the geological forces that govern the Eastern Mediterranean, forces that have shaped this region since long before human beings first walked its shores, and that continue to operate with relentless power beneath the surface of both land and sea. The Eastern Mediterranean is one of the most geologically active regions on Earth, a zone where the great tectonic plates that form the surface of our planet meet, collide, and grind against each other in slow, but immensely powerful movements that produce earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and dramatic changes in the configuration of land and sea. The geology of this region is dominated by the collision between the African plate, which is moving slowly northward, and the Eurasian plate, which forms the foundation of Europe and much of Asia. This collision has been ongoing for tens of millions of years, and it has produced the dramatic mountain ranges that characterize the Mediterranean world, including the Alps, the Apennines, and the rugged mountain chains of Greece and Turkey. But the collision is not a simple head-on impact. The geometry of the plate boundaries is complex, with smaller microplates caught between the major plates and moving in complicated patterns that produce a mosaic of different tectonic regimes across the region. In the Aegean Sea specifically, the situation is particularly complex. The Aegean microplate is being squeezed and stretched by the competing forces of the surrounding larger plates, producing a pattern of extension and thinning of the Earth's crust that has created the characteristic geography of the region, with its countless islands, its deep submarine basins, and its highly indented coastlines. This stretching and thinning is accommodated by numerous faults, fractures in the Earth's crust along which movement can occur, and these faults are the sources of the earthquakes that have afflicted this region throughout recorded history. Ancient Greek sources are full of references to earthquakes, which the Greeks attributed to the god Poseidon, the same deity who ruled the sea. This association was not arbitrary. The Greeks had observed that earthquakes in the sea were intimately connected, that great earthquakes often produced great waves, that coastal areas were particularly vulnerable to seismic destruction, and that the aftermath of major earthquakes sometimes included dramatic changes in the relationship between land and water. Ancient accounts describe harbors that were suddenly left dry by the retreat of the sea, coastlines that were inundated by waves of terrifying height, and entire cities that were shaken to rubble and then swept by the waters that followed. Modern seismology has confirmed and elaborated on what the ancients knew from direct observation. The Aegean region experiences frequent earthquakes, ranging from small tremors that cause no damage to major events capable of destroying cities and killing thousands. The historical record of earthquakes in this region is remarkably detailed, thanks both to ancient literary sources and to the systematic recording of seismic events that began in the Byzantine period and has continued to the present day. This record shows that destructive earthquakes have struck the Aegean coast on average roughly once per century, with some periods experiencing multiple major events in quick succession and other periods enjoying relative seismic quiet. The specific geological setting of our submerged city placed it in an area of particular seismic vulnerability. The coastal zone where the city was located lies along one of the major fault systems that accommodate the extension of the Aegean crust, a fault system that has been responsible for numerous significant earthquakes over the historical period. The city was built on terrain that was itself shaped by past seismic activity, on coastal sediments that overlay fractured bedrock, in a configuration that would have amplified the shaking produced by any nearby earthquake, and that would have been particularly susceptible to the phenomenon of liquefaction, the conversion of stable ground into a fluid-like state when subjected to intense seismic shaking. Liquefaction is one of the most destructive consequences of earthquakes in coastal and low-lying areas. When water-saturated sediments are shaken violently, the grains of sand and silt that normally support each other lose their structural coherence and begin to behave like a liquid rather than a solid. Buildings constructed on liquefied ground can sink, tilt, or collapse as their foundations lose the support they were designed to rely upon. And when the shaking stops and the ground resolidifies, the damage is permanent. Structures that sank during the liquefaction event remain sunken. Ground that subsided during the event remains subsided. The landscape is transformed, sometimes dramatically, in ways that cannot be undone. The physical evidence from our submerged city is consistent with an earthquake that produced widespread liquefaction and subsidence across the coastal terrain on which the city was built. The pattern of building damage visible in the underwater excavations shows the characteristic signatures of this type of destruction. Walls that have tilted rather than collapsed completely, as they might if hit by a lateral force like a tsunami wave. Foundations that have sunk unevenly, leaving buildings askew in ways that speak of ground that moved beneath them rather than forces that pushed against them. And a general pattern of subsidence that left the entire urban footprint sitting lower in relation to sea level than it had been before the event, low enough that the normal tides and waves could reach and eventually submerge structures that had previously been safely above the waterline. The earthquake that struck this city was not a single isolated event, but rather part of the ongoing seismic history of a region where earthquakes are endemic and have been occurring for millions of years. But to understand the specific destruction of this specific city, we need to consider not just the general seismicity of the region, but the particular characteristics of the event or events that produced the damage we observe. How large was the earthquake? How close was its epicenter to the city? How long did the shaking last? And what secondary effects, tsunamis, fires, landslides, did it produce? These questions are surprisingly difficult to answer definitively because the evidence available to us is limited and ambiguous. The archaeological record tells us that the city was damaged and eventually abandoned, and it tells us something about the pattern of that damage, but it cannot tell us directly how strong the shaking was or precisely when it occurred. The geological record, preserved in the sediments beneath and around the site, can provide some additional information, particularly if it preserves evidence of tsunami deposits or other distinctive signatures of seismic events. But interpreting this evidence requires sophisticated analysis and produces results that are probabilistic rather than certain. What the investigators have been able to establish is that the destruction of the city was not instantaneous, but occurred over a period of time, possibly involving multiple seismic events rather than a single catastrophic earthquake. The stratigraphy of the site, the sequence of layers that accumulated during and after the city's occupation, shows evidence of at least two distinct episodes of significant damage, separated by a period during which the city appears to have been at least partially reoccupied and some reconstruction undertaken. This suggests a scenario in which the city was damaged by an initial seismic event, partially recovered, and then was struck again by a subsequent event that completed the destruction and made continued occupation untenable. This pattern of repeated seismic damage is well documented in the historical record of Aegean cities. Ancient sources describe cities that were destroyed by earthquakes, rebuilt, and then destroyed again, sometimes multiple times over the span of a few centuries. The geological forces that produce earthquakes do not respect human timescales or human needs. A city that is built in a seismically active zone will, given enough time, inevitably experience destructive earthquakes, and the decision to rebuild in the same location after such an event is always a gamble against the probability of future destruction. Sometimes the gamble pays off for centuries, sometimes it does not. The secondary effects of the earthquakes that struck our city appear to have included tsunamis, though the evidence for this is less certain than the evidence for the seismic shaking and subsidence. Tsunami deposits, distinctive layers of sediment transported and laid down by tsunami waves, are sometimes preserved in the geological record and can be identified by their characteristic composition and structure. The investigators have identified several layers in the sediments around the site that may represent tsunami deposits, though alternative interpretations of these layers are possible, and the question remains under active investigation. If tsunamis did accompany the earthquakes that damaged the city, they would have added significantly to the destruction. Tsunami waves in the Aegean can reach heights of several meters and can travel considerable distances inland from the coast, carrying enormous destructive force. A city that had already been damaged by seismic shaking and had portions of its terrain subsided below sea level would have been extraordinarily vulnerable to tsunami inundation, with little capacity to resist the force of the waves and no possibility of rapid recovery from the flooding that would follow. The combination of earthquake damage, subsidence, and tsunami inundation would have been catastrophic, potentially making the difference between a city that could recover and rebuild and one that had to be permanently abandoned. The artifacts recovered from the layers associated with the city's destruction provide poignant evidence of the human dimensions of this catastrophe. Archaeology is often criticized for focusing on objects rather than people, for reducing the rich complexity of human life to collections of pottery shards and building foundations. But at moments like this, objects become windows into human experience in ways that are immediate and moving. The things that people left behind when disaster struck, the things they did not have time to take with them, the things that were buried by the collapse of their homes and the rushing of the waters, these objects speak across the millennia with an eloquence that no abstract historical analysis can match. Among the most striking artifacts from the destruction layers are a group of ceramic vessels that appear to have been abandoned in place, still containing traces of their original contents when they were buried. Chemical analysis of the residues inside these vessels has revealed evidence of olive oil, wine, grain, and other foodstuffs, the basic provisions of a Greek household that had been laid in store against future need, and that were never consumed because the future they had been saved for never arrived. These vessels were found in positions consistent with having fallen from shelves or storage structures during the earthquake, their contents spilling as they toppled and mixed with the debris of the collapsing building. In one residential structure, excavators found a small hoard of personal objects that had apparently been gathered together, perhaps by someone attempting to collect their most precious possessions for evacuation, but that were never successfully removed from the building. The hoard included several pieces of jewelry, bronze fibulae used to fasten clothing, and a small carved ivory figurine of exceptional quality. The presence of these objects together, clearly gathered deliberately rather than randomly scattered by the destruction, suggests the desperate actions of someone who knew that disaster was upon them and was trying to save what could be saved. Whether that person escaped successfully, carrying other possessions that we will never find, or whether they perished in the destruction along with the objects they left behind, we cannot know. The skeletal remains found at the site are fragmentary and difficult to interpret, but they include what appear to be the partial remains of at least 3 individuals who died during or shortly after the destructive events. These remains were found in positions and contexts that suggest they were victims of the disaster rather than individuals who died of natural causes and were deliberately buried. One set of remains was found beneath collapsed wall rubble, suggesting that this individual was killed by the collapse of a building during the earthquake. Another was found in a context suggesting drowning, possibly in the tsunami flooding that followed the seismic event. The third was found in a position that is ambiguous and may represent either a disaster victim or a later burial. The presence of human remains at disaster sites is always sobering, a reminder that the abstract historical events we reconstruct from archaeological evidence had immediate and often tragic consequences for real people. These individuals had names, had families, had lives that were being lived with all the complexity and significance that any human life possesses. They did not know when they woke up on the day of the disaster that it would be their last day, that the city they had lived in and perhaps loved would be destroyed, that their own lives would end in the chaos of collapsing buildings and rushing water. They were simply living, as all of us live, in the assumption that tomorrow will come and that the familiar structures of daily existence will continue. And then, suddenly and violently, they didn't. The investigation of the artifacts from the destruction layers has produced another category of evidence that is particularly valuable for understanding the city's final period, evidence of religious activity in the face of impending or ongoing disaster. Ancient peoples did not understand natural disasters in the secular, scientific terms that modern seismology and geology provide. They understood them as manifestations of divine will, as punishments or warnings from the gods, as signs that something had gone wrong in the relationship between the human community and the supernatural powers that govern the world. And their response to disaster was correspondingly religious, involving prayer, sacrifice, and the desperate attempt to propitiate whatever divine anger had brought destruction upon them. The evidence for this religious response at our submerged city comes primarily from votive deposits that appear to have been made during or shortly after the period of seismic destruction. These deposits, found at several locations across the site, including both the main temple precinct and smaller neighborhood shrines, show a marked intensification of religious activity compared to earlier periods. The quantity of offerings increases significantly, The types of offerings shift toward those associated with crisis and supplication, and the overall pattern suggests a community turning desperately to its gods for help in the face of overwhelming disaster. Among the offerings from this period are numerous terracotta figurines representing Poseidon in his role as earthquake god, a manifestation of the deity quite distinct from his more common representation as lord of the sea. These figures show Poseidon in threatening or angry postures, holding his trident as a weapon rather than as a symbol of marine sovereignty, and they appear to represent efforts to placate the deity believed to be responsible for the seismic destruction. The logic of this offering was straightforward. If Poseidon's anger had caused the earthquakes, then offerings to Poseidon might persuade him to relent and spare the city from further destruction. There are also offerings associated with healing and protection, figurines and dedicatory objects that invoke deities associated with health and safety. These suggest a community dealing not only with the immediate physical destruction of the earthquake, but with its medical and psychological aftermath, the injuries, the illnesses, the trauma that would have afflicted survivors in the days and weeks following the initial catastrophe. Ancient medicine was limited in what it could do for serious injuries, and religious appeal was often the primary recourse for people facing medical crises beyond the capacity of human healers to address. Perhaps most poignantly, there are offerings that appear to be associated with death and mourning, objects dedicated on behalf of those who had died in the disaster. Greek religion included elaborate traditions for the care of the dead, including grave goods placed with the deceased, memorial offerings made at graves and tombs, and ongoing rituals to ensure that the souls of the dead were properly honored and cared for in the afterlife. The presence of such offerings in the destruction layers suggests a community in mourning, one that had lost members to the disaster and was attempting to fulfill its religious obligations to the dead, even in the midst of ongoing crisis. The question of how long the city survived after the initial seismic destruction and what the inhabitants attempted to do in response to the damage is one that the archaeological evidence addresses in some detail. The stratigraphy of the site shows that the period between the first major destructive event and the final abandonment of the city spans a significant interval of time, possibly several decades or even longer. During this interval, there is clear evidence of reconstruction efforts, of attempts to repair damaged buildings, clear debris from streets, and restore the functionality of the urban infrastructure. These reconstruction efforts were, in some respects, remarkably ambitious. Several of the larger buildings in the city show evidence of post-earthquake repairs, including the replacement of collapsed columns, the rebuilding of damaged walls, and the installation of new flooring over debris-covered surfaces. The main temple precinct appears to have been a particular focus of reconstruction activity, suggesting that restoring the religious heart of the community was a priority even in the midst of broader urban damage. The scale of these repairs indicates a community that was determined to survive, that was willing to invest substantial resources in rebuilding, and that had not yet accepted that the city was ultimately doomed. But the repairs were also, in hindsight, inadequate to the challenge the community faced. The fundamental problem was not the damage to individual buildings, which could be repaired, but the change in the relationship between the city and the sea that the seismic subsidence had produced. The city now sat lower in relation to sea level than it had before the earthquake. Areas that had previously been safely above the waterline were now regularly flooded by high tides and storm waves. The harbor facilities that had been the city's connection to the maritime commerce on which its economy depended were now functioning poorly or not at all, their infrastructure damaged and their basin depths altered by the subsidence. The archaeological evidence shows that the community attempted to adapt to these changed conditions. There are traces of what appear to be defensive structures, seawalls or barriers intended to protect low-lying areas from marine flooding. There is evidence that some buildings were raised or elevated to lift their floor surfaces above the new flood level, and there is evidence that certain areas of the city were abandoned while others continued to be occupied, suggesting a strategic retreat from the most damaged and vulnerable zones to higher ground that remained more viable. But ultimately, these adaptations were not enough. The sea continued to advance, gradually reclaiming more and more of the city's footprint. The seawalls that had been built to hold back the water eventually failed or were overtopped. The economic base of the community, dependent on maritime commerce and fishing, could not be maintained in a city whose harbor was no longer functional. And when the second major seismic event struck, the city's capacity to absorb additional damage and continue functioning was exhausted. The final abandonment of the city appears to have been relatively orderly. Unlike the first seismic event, which left evidence of sudden violent destruction and items abandoned in panic, the final departure shows the characteristics of a managed withdrawal. The most valuable and portable objects were removed. Useful building materials were salvaged from structures that were being abandoned. The community that had struggled for years or decades to maintain its existence in an increasingly hostile location finally accepted that the struggle was lost and moved elsewhere to continue their lives. Where did they go? This is one of the questions that the investigation has not yet been able to answer definitively, but there are some tantalizing clues. Ancient Greek communities were not isolated units. They were connected to networks of other communities by bonds of kinship, commerce, religion, and political alliance. When a city was destroyed by disaster, its surviving inhabitants did not simply vanish into anonymity. They moved to other communities where they had connections, where they could find refuge and rebuild their lives, where they could maintain their identity as a community, even though they no longer occupied their original home. The ancient Greek world has numerous examples of communities that survived the destruction of their original settlements and continued their existence elsewhere. The most famous example is probably the city of Smyrna, which was destroyed and abandoned in the early first millennium before the Common Era, but was refounded on a new site nearby several centuries later, explicitly preserving the identity and traditions of the original community. Other examples include cities that were relocated after earthquakes, floods, or attacks, their populations moving to new locations while maintaining their civic identity, their religious traditions, and their sense of continuity with their destroyed predecessors. If the inhabitants of our submerged city followed this pattern, as seems likely, then their descendants may have continued to live in the region for centuries after the original city was lost, preserving memories and traditions that connected them to the submerged site even as the physical city itself faded beneath the waves. These preserved traditions may be the origin of the local knowledge that first pointed investigators toward the site, the stories passed down through generations of fishing families about a place beneath the water where their ancestors had lived long ago. The memory persisted even when the city itself was invisible, kept alive by communities that traced their roots to the lost settlement and that maintained, across the centuries, a sense of connection to a place they could no longer see or visit. This pattern of preserved memory is one of the most fascinating aspects of the relationship between submerged sites and the communities that live near them. All around the Mediterranean, there are places where local tradition preserves knowledge of underwater ruins, knowledge that in many cases predates any systematic archaeological investigation, and that has sometimes proven remarkably accurate when finally tested against scientific evidence. These traditions represent a form of cultural memory that operates over timescales of centuries or millennia, preserving information about the past through mechanisms of oral transmission that we are only beginning to understand. The persistence of such traditions is not guaranteed. Many submerged sites have no associated local memory, their existence completely forgot until accidentally discovered or systematically revealed by modern survey technology. But when traditions do persist, they can provide invaluable guidance for archaeological investigation, pointing researchers towards specific locations that might otherwise take years or decades to identify through systematic survey alone. The collaboration between scientific archaeology and traditional local knowledge is one of the most productive approaches to underwater investigation, combining the technological capabilities of modern research with the accumulated observations of communities that have lived alongside these sites for generations. We have spent considerable time exploring what happened to this city and how it came to rest beneath the sea. Now let us turn to a different but equally important question. What does this discovery tell us about ancient Greek civilization more broadly? What does a single submerged city, however well preserved and however thoroughly investigated, contribute to our understanding of the ancient world? The answer to this question operates on several levels. At the most basic level, every new archaeological site expands our database of evidence about the past, adding new artifacts, new architectural examples, new environmental data, and new potential for comparative analysis with other sites. Our submerged city contributes to this database in particularly valuable ways because of its exceptional preservation, and because it represents a type of site, a coastal urban settlement, that is underrepresented in the terrestrial archaeological record for reasons we have already discussed. But beyond simply adding to the database, this discovery challenges and refines some of our assumptions about how ancient Greek civilization worked. The conventional picture of Greek civilization, based heavily on the famous major centers like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and the great Ionian cities, tends to emphasize the distinctive features of those cities, their political innovations, their artistic achievements, their intellectual contributions, their military and commercial power. This emphasis is not wrong because these cities were indeed distinctive and important. But it can create an incomplete picture if it leads us to forget that the famous centers existed within a much larger context of smaller communities that participated in Greek civilization without being individually famous, that absorbed and adapted the cultural innovations of the major centers, and that in aggregate represented the bulk of the Greek population and the Greek economic output. Our submerged city was one of these smaller communities, and its evidence provides a window into what life was like in the parts of the Greek world that did not produce famous philosophers or win decisive battles or commission monuments that would endure to the present day. What we see through this window is a community that was fully integrated into the broader Greek cultural world, that participated in the same religious traditions, the same social customs, the same material culture that we know from the famous centers, but that adapted these elements to its own local circumstances and developed its own distinctive local character. The religious life of the city, for example, shows a combination of pan-Hellenic elements and local specificity. The major deities of the Greek pantheon are represented in the votive deposits and religious architecture of the site, but they are represented in ways that reflect the particular concerns and circumstances of a coastal community dependent on the sea. Poseidon's prominence in the religious assemblage is not surprising given the city's maritime orientation, but the specific forms in which he is represented, the particular epithets by which he was invoked, the specific rituals that appear to have been practiced in his honor, all of these show local characteristics that distinguish this community's worship from the worship of Poseidon in other Greek cities. Similarly, the material culture of the city shows a distinctive combination of imported goods and local production. The presence of high-quality pottery from the major Greek production centers tells us that this community was connected to long-distance trade networks and had access to the products of Greek commercial civilization. But the presence of locally produced pottery, made from local clays and decorated in styles that show both conformity to broader Greek traditions and local variations, tells us that the community also had its own productive capacity and its own aesthetic identity. This is exactly what we would expect in a healthy, functioning Greek community of this size and period, and the evidence from the submerged site confirms and illustrates our theoretical expectations in concrete detail. The evidence from our submerged city also contributes to ongoing scholarly debates about specific aspects of ancient Greek civilization, debates that cannot be resolved definitively on the basis of a single site, but that can be advanced by the addition of new evidence and new perspectives. One such debate concerns the nature and extent of Greek colonization in the Archaic period. The traditional picture of Greek colonization, based primarily on ancient literary sources, presents it as a deliberate, organized process in which established Greek cities sent out expeditions to found new communities at selected locations around the Mediterranean. These colonizing expeditions were supposedly led by designated founders, equipped with religious sanctions and practical resources, and established new cities that maintained formal ties with their mother cities while developing their own independent existence. This traditional picture has been challenged in recent decades by archaeologists who argue that the reality was more complex and more varied than the literary sources suggest. Some scholars emphasize the role of gradual, organic processes of settlement expansion rather than formal colonizing expeditions. Others emphasize the importance of pre-existing contact and exchange networks that preceded formal colonization and that shaped where and how Greek settlements were established. Still others emphasize the diversity of colonizing experiences, arguing that there was no single model of Greek colonization, but rather many different patterns reflecting different circumstances and different motivations. Our submerged city contributes to this debate because its origins appear to lie in the period when Greek colonization was most active, and because its characteristics can be compared with both the traditional model and the revisionist alternatives. The evidence suggests that this community developed gradually over time, rather than being founded in a single formal act of colonization, supporting the arguments of those who emphasize organic processes of settlement expansion. But it also shows clear evidence of connection to established Greek cultural centers from an early period, supporting the arguments of those who emphasize the importance of pre-existing contact networks. The site does not definitively resolve the debate, but it adds a valuable new data point and demonstrates the kind of complexity that characterizes actual historical processes as opposed to simplified theoretical models. Another debate to which the submerged city contributes concerns the economic history of the ancient Greek world. Traditional economic history has tended to emphasize the role of major commercial centers, the cities that minted their own coinage, dominated regional trade networks, and accumulated the wealth that funded monumental architecture and military power. This emphasis reflects both the nature of the ancient sources, which tend to focus on major centers, and the nature of the archaeological evidence, which is most abundant and most impressive at the sites of major cities. But the submerged city reminds us that the economy of the ancient Greek world was not simply the sum of its major commercial centers. It was a complex system of interconnected communities of all sizes, each contributing to and drawing from the broader economic network in its own way. A small coastal city like ours may not have dominated regional trade or accumulated enormous wealth, but it participated in economic exchange, produced goods for local consumption and potentially for export, provided services to passing maritime traffic, and contributed to the overall productive capacity of the Greek economic world. The evidence from the submerged site shows a community that was economically active and economically connected. The imported goods found at the site demonstrate participation in long-distance trade networks. The local productive facilities demonstrate an economic base beyond simple subsistence agriculture and fishing. The harbor infrastructure demonstrates a community that serviced maritime commerce and that derived economic benefit from its position along shipping routes. This is the picture of a small but functional economic unit, integrated into larger networks and contributing to the overall prosperity of the region. exactly the kind of community that the major commercial centers depended upon, but that is often invisible in conventional economic histories. Perhaps the most profound contribution of the submerged city to our understanding of ancient Greek civilization lies not in any specific debate or question, but in the general lesson it teaches about the incompleteness of our knowledge and the humility that this incompleteness should inspire. We think we know a great deal about ancient Greece. We have ancient texts, ancient buildings, ancient artifacts in abundance. We have 2 centuries of systematic archaeological investigation and scholarly analysis. We have museums full of Greek art and libraries full of books about Greek history and culture. But the submerged city reminds us that beneath this apparently comprehensive knowledge lies a vast territory of the unknown, an archive of evidence that we have barely begun to explore, and that has the potential to transform our understanding in ways we cannot predict. This single site, discovered essentially by accident and investigated over just a few years, has already revealed a community whose existence was previously unknown and whose characteristics complicate our understanding of Greek colonization, Greek economy, and Greek coastal civilization. How many other such communities lie waiting to be found? How much of the picture we think we have is actually incomplete or distorted because it is based on a biased sample of the available evidence? The underwater world represents a frontier of archaeological knowledge that is only beginning to be explored. The technology to investigate submerged sites systematically is relatively new. The methodologies to interpret submerged sites rigorously are still being developed. The institutional and financial resources to support underwater archaeology are still limited compared to those available for terrestrial investigation. All of this means that the pace of discovery in underwater archaeology is likely to accelerate in the coming decades as technology improves, methodologies mature, and resources grow. What will we find when we look more systematically at the submerged coastlines of the ancient Mediterranean? The evidence from sites like our submerged city suggests that we will find a world of coastal settlement far more extensive and more sophisticated than the terrestrial evidence alone would suggest. We will find cities and towns and villages that were lost to the sea and that have been waiting for millennia to be rediscovered. We will find artifacts and structures and inscriptions that will fill gaps in our knowledge and challenge assumptions we did not know we were making. We will find, in short, a past that is richer and more complex than we had allowed ourselves to imagine. This prospect should inspire both excitement and humility. Excitement because the discoveries that await us will be genuinely new knowledge, information about the past that has never been available before, and that will expand the horizons of what we can know and understand. Humility because the existence of so much yet to be discovered reminds us that our current knowledge, however impressive it may seem, is only a partial and provisional approximation of a reality that was far vaster and far more complex than any reconstruction we can make. Now we must address directly the question that has hovered at the edges of this entire investigation, the question that many viewers will have been asking since the beginning of this documentary. The question of Atlantis. Atlantis is the most famous lost city in world culture, and the discovery of any real submerged ancient city inevitably invites comparison to Plato's legendary account. We discussed the Atlantis story briefly in the first part of this documentary, noting its origins in Plato's dialogues and its uncertain relationship to historical reality. Now we must engage with it more fully, asking what a real submerged city can teach us about the Atlantis legend, and what the Atlantis legend can teach us about how cultures process memories of catastrophic loss. The first thing to say clearly is that our submerged city is not Atlantis. It does not match the specific geographical claims Plato makes about Atlantis, which he places beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. It does not match the chronological claims Plato makes about Atlantis, which he dates to 9,000 years before Solon's time, a date that would place it far earlier than any known urban civilization. It does not match the scale claims Plato makes about Atlantis, which he describes as a vast empire controlling territory across the Atlantic and Mediterranean worlds. Our submerged city is a real place with real historical connections, and those connections place it firmly within the world of ancient Greek coastal civilization rather than in the realm of mythological speculation. But acknowledging that our city is not Atlantis does not mean that the Atlantis legend is irrelevant to understanding it. On the contrary, the Atlantis legend and the real submerged city illuminate each other in ways that are worth exploring carefully. Plato's Atlantis story, whatever its ultimate origins, captures something real and important about the experience of living in a world where cities can be destroyed by natural catastrophe and swallowed by the sea. The Greeks knew that this happened. They had seen it happen, they had heard stories about it happening in the past. The destruction of coastal settlements by earthquakes, tsunamis, and coastal subsidence was a real feature of Mediterranean life, and the cultural memory of such events persisted in oral traditions that were eventually written down by authors like Plato. The specific features of the Atlantis story, the emphasis on hubris and divine punishment, the dramatic scale of the destruction, the complete disappearance of the civilization beneath the waves, these features may be mythological elaborations rather than historical reports. But they are elaborations of a real phenomenon, a phenomenon that our submerged city exemplifies in concrete detail. The city we have been investigating was destroyed by natural forces and swallowed by the sea, just as Atlantis was said to be. The difference is that our city is real and can be studied scientifically, while Atlantis remains a literary creation whose relationship to any specific historical reality cannot be established. What the submerged city shows us is that the Atlantis legend, even if it is not literally true, is responding to real features of the Mediterranean world. There really were cities that were destroyed and submerged. There really were civilizations that were lost to the sea. The memory of these events really was preserved, in various forms and with various degrees of elaboration, in the cultural traditions of the peoples who survived them. Plato's Atlantis story is one expression of this broader cultural memory, a particularly dramatic and philosophically charged expression that has captured the imagination of countless generations since it was written. Understanding the Atlantis legend in this way, as a mythological elaboration of real historical and geological phenomena, allows us to appreciate both its power and its limitations. Its power lies in its capacity to evoke the fragility of human civilization and the awesome destructive force of natural catastrophe. Its limitations lie in its inability to provide specific historical information about any particular event or place. The Atlantis legend is true in the sense that it captures something real about human experience in a geologically active world. It is false in the sense that it cannot be mapped onto any specific historical civilization or any specific historical event. Our submerged city, by contrast, provides exactly what the Atlantis legend lacks: specific historical information about a specific place and a specific community. We can study the city's artifacts and architecture. We can trace its economic connections and cultural affiliations. We can investigate the specific geological events that destroyed it. We can attempt to identify it with places mentioned in ancient sources. We can, in short, do history rather than mythology, reconstructing the reality of what happened rather than elaborating on the symbolism of what it might mean. The tension between myth and history that the Atlantis question raises is one of the central intellectual challenges of ancient studies. Ancient peoples told stories about their past, stories that mixed what we would call historical information with what we would call mythological elaboration. Separating the historical kernel from the mythological additions is rarely straightforward, and scholars have been debating how to do it for as long as the modern study of antiquity has existed. The discovery of real submerged cities contributes to this debate by providing concrete examples of the kind of events that mythological traditions may be remembering. When we find a city that was destroyed by earthquake and tsunami and swallowed by the sea, we have a real historical example of the phenomenon that stories like the Atlantis legend are describing. This does not prove that any specific legend is based on any specific historical event, but it demonstrates that the basic phenomenon underlying the legends is real, and that searching for historical kernels within mythological traditions is not a fool's errand. The most famous and most successful example of this kind of historical kernel extraction is the case of Troy. For centuries, the Trojan War as described in Homer's Iliad was regarded by most scholars as pure mythology, a story invented for literary and cultural purposes without any basis in historical reality. Then, in the late 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann excavated the site of Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey and discovered the remains of a Bronze Age city that corresponded in location and approximate date to the Troy of Homeric tradition. The discovery did not prove that the Trojan War as Homer described it actually happened, but it demonstrated that there was a real city in the right place at the right time, and that the Homeric tradition was preserving some kind of genuine historical memory rather than inventing everything from whole cloth. The submerged cities of the Mediterranean represent a similar opportunity. The discovery of real cities that match the general pattern of traditions about drowned settlements demonstrates that those traditions may be preserving genuine historical memories. The specific task of matching particular traditions to particular sites is difficult and will require much more evidence than we currently have. But the general principle that mythological traditions about submerged cities may have historical kernels worth extracting is established by discoveries like the one we have been exploring. This does not mean that every story about a drowned city is based on a real historical event. Cultures invent stories for many reasons, and not every story is an encoded historical memory. But it does mean that dismissing such stories as pure invention is premature, and that investigating the possible historical basis of traditional stories about lost cities is a legitimate and potentially productive scholarly enterprise. The future of underwater archaeology promises many more discoveries like the one we have been exploring, discoveries that will expand our knowledge of the submerged past and that will continue to reshape our understanding of ancient civilizations. The technology available for underwater investigation is advancing rapidly, making it possible to survey larger areas more quickly, to image submerged sites in greater detail, and to recover artifacts more safely and more completely. One of the most exciting technological developments in recent years is the increasing use of autonomous underwater vehicles for archaeological survey. These robotic submersibles can operate for extended periods without direct human control, systematically scanning the seafloor and returning data that can be analyzed to identify potential archaeological sites. The use of autonomous vehicles dramatically expands the area that can be surveyed in a given period of time, making it practical to investigate regions of the seafloor that would be impossible to cover using traditional diver-based methods. Another important development is the improvement of remote sensing technologies, particularly side-scan sonar and multi-beam bathymetry, that can produce detailed images of the seafloor without requiring physical presence at the site. These technologies can reveal the outlines of submerged structures from considerable distances, allowing researchers to identify sites of potential interest before committing the substantial resources required for close-up investigation. The initial identification of our submerged city depended heavily on these remote sensing technologies, and similar technologies are revealing potential sites across the Mediterranean and beyond. The combination of improved survey technology and improved understanding of coastal geological processes is allowing researchers to develop predictive models for where submerged archaeological sites are most likely to be found. These models incorporate information about ancient coastlines, sea level history, tectonic activity, sediment transport, and other factors to identify zones of high archaeological potential. Targeted survey of these high-potential zones is likely to be far more productive than random searching, and the development of increasingly sophisticated predictive models is one of the most important methodological advances in underwater archaeology. But technology alone is not sufficient. The investigation of submerged sites also requires institutional support, funding, and trained personnel. Underwater archaeology is expensive and technically demanding, and the number of researchers with the necessary skills and the resources to apply them is still limited. Building the capacity for underwater archaeological investigation, training new generations of researchers, securing stable funding for long-term projects, and building the institutional infrastructure to support sustained research programs are all essential for realizing the potential that improved technology creates. The submerged city we have been exploring is being investigated by a team that has benefited from years of institutional investment in building capacity for underwater research. The training programs, the equipment, the funding, the collaborative relationships with other institutions, all of these elements had to be put in place before the investigation could begin. The success of this project demonstrates what is possible when the necessary investment is made, and it should serve as an argument for continued and expanded investment in underwater archaeological capacity. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration, let us return to the human dimensions of this story. We have talked about geology and archaeology, about technology and methodology, about scholarly debates and mythological traditions. But underlying all of this is a story about people, about the human beings who built this city, lived in it, loved it, and ultimately lost it. We do not know their names. We do not know their individual stories. We do not have their letters or their diaries or their autobiographies. What we have are the physical traces they left behind, the buildings they constructed, the objects they used, the offerings they made to their gods, the bodies of those who died in the catastrophe that destroyed their home. From these physical traces, we have tried to reconstruct something of who they were and how they lived. They were Greeks, participants in one of the most creative and influential civilizations in human history. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, followed Greek customs, made and used Greek artifacts. They were part of a cultural world that stretched across the Mediterranean, connected by trade and travel and shared tradition to communities thousands of kilometers away. But they were also distinctly themselves, inhabitants of a particular place with its own particular characteristics, its own relationship to the sea, its own local traditions and local concerns. They were coastal people oriented toward the water in ways that shaped every aspect of their existence. The sea was their highway, their larder, their workplace, and their connection to the wider world. They knew its moods and its dangers. They propitiated its gods and honored its dead. They built their city facing the water, and when they looked out from their harbor or their temples, what they saw was the sea stretching to the horizon, promising both prosperity and peril. They were resilient people, survivors who faced disaster and did not immediately give up. When the first earthquake struck, they did not abandon their city. They repaired what could be repaired, adapted to what could not be changed, and continued their lives in a place that had become more difficult and more dangerous. They persisted for years, perhaps for decades, before finally accepting that the struggle could not be won and moving elsewhere to continue their existence. And they were mortal people, subject to the same limitations and the same fate that awaits all human beings and all human communities. Their city is gone, swallowed by the sea, reduced to ruins on the ocean floor. Their names are forgotten. Their individual lives cannot be recovered. They have become, like all the countless billions who lived and died before recorded history, anonymous participants in the great human story rather than individually known characters in it. But they were real. The mosaic floor that lies beneath the sediment was laid by real hands, designed by a real mind, paid for by real money accumulated through real work. The terracotta figurines that were offered at the shrine were carried there by real people, people who had real concerns and real hopes and real fears, who believed that their offerings might help and who made them anyway even if they weren't sure. The bodies of those who died in the catastrophe were real bodies, belonging to real people who had real names and real families and real lives that ended in real terror and real pain. Archaeology recovers the physical traces of the past, but what it is ultimately trying to understand is the human reality behind those traces. The submerged city we have been exploring is made of stone and ceramic and bronze, materials that can survive for millennia beneath the sea. But what made it a city was not the stone and the ceramic and the bronze. What made it a city was the human community that inhabited it, the web of relationships and institutions and shared practices that turned a collection of buildings into a functioning human settlement. That human community is gone, dissolved back into the anonymity from which all human communities eventually emerge and to which they all eventually return. But for a time, for the centuries during which this place flourished, it was home to real people living real lives, and that fact deserves our recognition and our respect. The sea that swallowed this city has kept faith with it in a way, by burying the ruins in protective sediment, by sealing them away from the destructive forces that would have erased them had they remained on land. The sea has preserved a record of this community that would otherwise have been lost. The same element that ended the city's existence has also ensured that evidence of that existence would survive, waiting for the moment when human beings would develop the technology and the curiosity to come looking. We came looking, we found what was there, and now we are trying to understand it, to make sense of the physical evidence, to reconstruct the human reality, to tell the story of a place and a people that would otherwise be completely forgotten. This is what archaeology does. It recovers the past, not completely, not perfectly, but in fragmentary glimpses that can be assembled into pictures of how people lived. It gives voice to the voiceless, allowing the dead to speak through the objects they left behind. It extends the reach of human memory backward in time, far beyond what any individual or any culture could remember on their own, to the deep past where our common human heritage has its roots. The submerged city is one chapter in this larger story of archaeological recovery. It is an important chapter because the site is exceptionally well preserved and because it represents a type of settlement that is underrepresented in our evidence for the ancient world. But it is also one chapter among many, one site among the countless sites that remain to be discovered and investigated, one community among the countless communities that lived and died in the ancient world. The work of understanding this city is not finished. Many areas of the site remain to be excavated. Many artifacts remain to be analyzed. Many questions remain to be answered. The investigation will continue for years, probably for decades, gradually adding to our knowledge and refining our understanding. What we have presented in this documentary is a snapshot of our current understanding, an account of what we know now that will inevitably be superseded by what we learn in the future. That is as it should be. Knowledge grows, understanding deepens. New evidence emerges and forces revision of old conclusions. This is how scholarship works, through the gradual accumulation of knowledge over time, each generation building on the work of those who came before and leaving a foundation for those who will come after. The submerged city will continue to yield its secrets. Researchers will continue to dive, to excavate, to analyze, to publish, to debate. The story we have told here will be refined and corrected and expanded, and eventually, perhaps, the city will have a name, an identity that links it to the larger historical record of the ancient Greek world and allows us to understand it not just as an anonymous archaeological site, but as a known community with a known place in history. We began this documentary by noting that the sea has been keeping secrets for thousands of years. We end it by acknowledging that many of those secrets remain to be discovered, and that the work of discovery is only beginning. The submerged city we have explored is proof of what lies waiting beneath the waves, evidence that the ancient world was larger and more complex than the terrestrial archaeological record alone would suggest, and that the seafloor holds an archive of human history that we are only now learning to read. The discovery of this city should inspire us to look further, to search more systematically, to develop the technologies and the methodologies and the institutional capacities that will allow us to explore the submerged past more completely. What we find will surprise us, challenge us, and enrich our understanding of who we are and where we came from. The past is not gone. It is preserved fragmentarily but genuinely in the physical traces that human beings left behind, traces that lie waiting in the earth and under the sea for us to find them and learn what they have to teach. The people who built the submerged city could not have imagined us, the distant descendants who would come thousands of years later to sift through the ruins of their home. They could not have known that the catastrophe that destroyed their city would also preserve it, that the sea that swallowed their streets would also protect them, that the disaster that ended their community would also ensure that evidence of its existence would survive for future generations to find. But here we are, standing at the intersection of past and present, holding in our hands the artifacts they made and walking through the streets they walked. We cannot bring them back. We cannot undo the catastrophe that took their city, but we can remember them, reconstruct them, tell their story to a world that had forgotten they ever existed. That is what archaeology offers, not resurrection but remembrance, not recovery of the lost but acknowledgement that they lived. Beneath the waves the city waits, silent, still, patient after millennia. It has given up some of its secrets, but it holds many more. The divers will return, the excavations will continue. The analysis will proceed, and slowly, piece by piece, artifact by artifact, insight by insight, the picture will become clearer, the story more complete, the community more fully known. This is the work of archaeology, the long, patient labor of understanding. It takes time, it takes resources, it takes dedication, but what it yields is irreplaceable, knowledge of who we are, where we came from, and what human beings are capable of, both in achievement and in loss. The submerged city stands as testimony to both. It is a monument to human achievement, evidence that people can build sophisticated urban settlements, create beautiful objects, maintain complex social institutions, and sustain communities over centuries in challenging coastal environments. It is also a monument to human vulnerability, evidence that nature can destroy in hours what human beings have built over generations, that the forces of the earth are indifferent to human hopes and human needs, and that all our achievements are ultimately temporary, subject to the geological processes that operate on timescales far beyond human planning. But between the achievement and the loss, there was life. There were people waking up in the morning and going to sleep at night. There were children learning and adults working. There were prayers offered and meals shared. There was love and loss, joy and sorrow, the full range of human experience that every human community contains. That is what the submerged city represents, finally, not just buildings and artifacts, but life, human life in all its complexity and richness, lived in a particular place at a particular time by particular people who are gone now, but who were once as real as you and me. They deserve to be remembered, they deserve to have their story told. And through the patient work of archaeology, the careful investigation of what the sea has preserved, we are doing what we can to give them that memory, that story, that acknowledgement of their reality. The sea took their city, but it could not take everything. The physical traces remain, the evidence survives. And through that evidence, across the vast gulf of time that separates us, we can reach back and touch, however briefly and however incompletely, the lives that were lived there before the water came. That is the gift the submerged city offers. That is what makes its discovery so profound. Not just scientific knowledge, though it offers that. Not just historical information, though it offers that too. But human connection, the recognition that the people of the past were people like us, that their lives mattered as ours matter, that their community deserved to exist and to be remembered as all communities deserve. We remember them now, we tell their story, and in doing so we fulfill an obligation that runs backward across the centuries, from us to them, from the living to the dead, from those who came after to those who came before. The city beneath the waves is silent. But through archaeology, through investigation, through the patient work of understanding, we give it voice again. We let it speak of what it was, what its people achieved, what they lost, and what remains of them now that they are gone. This is the power of archaeology. This is why we dig, why we dive, why we analyze and interpret and publish. Because the past deserves to be known, because the people who lived there deserve to be remembered. Because the human story, in all its length and all its complexity, belongs to all of us, and recovering its forgotten chapters is one of the most important things we can do. The submerged city has been found, its story has begun to be told, and the work continues beneath the waves in the laboratories and libraries, in the minds of researchers who will spend their careers trying to understand what happened there. That is how it should be. The past is not a closed book. It is an ongoing investigation, a conversation across time, a project that each generation takes up and passes on to the next. We have received this project from those who came before us, and we will pass it on to those who come after. The submerged city is now part of that project, one more chapter in the vast ongoing story of human understanding. Beneath the waves, the city waits. We have come looking, we have begun to understand, and the search continues.